Welcome to Greenwich Village in New York City, or as it's better known, the capital of Bohemia. This is one of the breeding grounds of radical ideas about sex, art, and politics. Men and women explore experimentation with their sexual roles, morality, and orientation. In fantastic ethnic restaurants like this one portrayed in the Times-Dispatch, they enjoy the release of societal bonds and a culture of artistic expression, yet many here in Greenwich Village feel a strong pull towards progressive politics. Bohemians have carefully written scripts, built sets, and publicized to prepare for this day. In a few hours, the industrial workers of the World Union will present orators after compelling theatrics and song put on by Greenwich Village residents like Hannah Silverman, dubbed the Little Firebrand of the pageant by the New York Tribune. But activism like this was not limited to Bohemians. The Progressive Party had begun to spread throughout the country. Progressives believed in the power of the democratic system to fix social and economic problems, and the necessity of political reform to enable the government to effectively respond to their desires. For example, there was outrage at the feeble attempts by city governments to deal with sanitation and public services with the booming population growth. Responding to the problem, the National Municipal League fought for the development of the commission system, which placed more specialized leaders in power and held them accountable to the people. Sanitation was an important part of progressive reform. Oliver Wendell Holmes was a writer and doctor who became a reformer for hygiene, scientific medical practices, and sanitation in both cities and hospitals. Sanitation was also pursued by many politicians. Progressives like Mayor Thomas L. Johnson also attacked city policy, increasing efficiency and providing services like public bathhouses and lower streetcar fares. Robert L. La Follette, a senator from Wisconsin, was an excellent example of how progressives improved policy. He developed the Wisconsin Idea, where bills were written with the input of experts and intellectuals who studied the issues they were addressing. The New York Tribune notes in an article about La Follette his brilliant employment of this technique, when he had scientists study the railroad industry to write law that would allow for private ownership and profit, while lowering the costs for the public. While progressives were unified in their belief of the value of scientific research and policy, and the strength they drew from the Protestant evangelical movements, they suffered from conflicting ideals. They wanted to restrain public power over government, and leave it to specialists in the commission system. Simultaneously, they sought to open up other areas of politics, putting the power to elect party nominees, and through the 17th Amendment power to elect senators into the hands of voters. The interests of progressives also varied in different parts of the country. Western progressives were particularly hostile towards corporations like the Union Pacific Railroads and fought hard within Western industries for 8-hour workdays for women, child labor laws, and more affordable utilities. Similarly, Southern progressives like Edward Gardner Murphy and Alexander McKelway fought for child labor, however they found little success. In the South, there was an outcry against child labor laws as they cut off a source of income for families, and they were subsequently weakly enforced. The Southern progressive movement was also weakened by its exclusion of an entire population, African Americans. Their full support of segregation pushed African Americans to seek a different outlet for their own political movements. Imagine that it is July 1905 and a group of some of the most influential and educated African-American leaders are meeting together across the Canadian border near Niagara Falls. They protested the legal segregation and denial of civil rights to the nation's black population through actions such as the exclusion of blacks from labor unions and the curtailment of voting. W.E.B. Du Bois was a primary leader of the movement, working alongside the editor of The Guardian, William Monroe Trotter. W.E.B. Du Bois was the first African-American to get a Ph.D. and was the author of many books while exploring double consciousness. He criticized Booker T. Washington, a racist author and philosopher, for his philosophy accepting the alleged inferiority of the Negro as stated by Farragut. Du Bois rebutted, saying the problem with the 20th century is the problem of the color line. As recounted by Zinn, Trotter asked 9 provoking questions for Booker T. Washington in his magazine, which led to arguments and fistfights among readers. The Niagara Falls Convention was held in Ontario because they felt discriminated against in Buffalo, New York. This was the start of the Niagara movement. They said, any discrimination based simply on race or color is barbarous. Persistent manly agitation is the way to liberty. While the movement wasn't very successful and didn't cause much change, its leaders proceeded to attend to other conferences, which led to the creation of the NAACP. Even though in itself it did not have a large impact, its implications for African American communities were immense. The Niagara movement also fought against racial segregation, such as examples like the Klansman, which supported the Ku Klux Klan and advocated for segregation. With the changing state of the nation, so changed the media with it. Muckraking, a new kind of way of conveying information, became very prevalent in the reform-riddled society. Muckraking journalism was based on exposing the illegal or corrupt deeds of corporations, institutions, and political figures. Many corporations and individuals contributed to the society that was used to muckraking. McClure's Magazine was a publication known for muckraking, attacking corporations like the Standard Oil Company. Ida Tarbell, an influential muckraker of the time period, was known for a book, The History of the Standard Oil Company, and her work for McClure's Magazine. Jacob Riis was a muckraker who exposed the living conditions of immigrants in New York City. He did this effectively in the book How the Other Half Lives. Lincoln Steffens was a muckraker who exposed political corruption in a series of articles he wrote for McClure's Magazine, which were later published in the Same of the Cities in 1904. Lewis Hine used photography to combat child labor. David Graham Phillips was a muckraker whose writing contributed to the passing of the 17th Amendment, opening up the Senate to the public's vote. Social Control by Edward A. Ross was about the relationship between society and human psychology and the individual's role in both. Thus, many people contributed to the muckraking society and further contributed to the progressive ideas that had been permeating the nation. Reform was beginning to be a very important change happening all over the country, with unions forming and lobbying for rights, sanitation committees improving city life, and minorities fighting for equality. The nation was in a crucial period of progressive transition. Behind this was a powerful and active force: women. Charity work throughout the country was spearheaded and activated by many women, the most notable of which are Lillian Wald, Jane Addams, and Florence Kelley. Working to benefit the community and the poor became a new national option for college-educated women. Offering a path different from the monotony of teaching, many women chose to work in poor communities as nurses, caretakers, and activists for social reform. A key part of this movement was the creation of settlement houses. Jane Addams, a graduate of Rockford College, started one of the first settlement houses called Hull House in Chicago, 1889. Addams spoke often of the need for settlement houses both to provide help for the poor and also an occupation in which women could connect to the real world. In 1895, Lillian Wald, a former nurse and teacher, established one of the most successful settlement houses on what was then the most crowded neighborhood in the world, New York's Lower East Side. Named the Henry Street Settlement, she and other women provided cheap health care and shelter for the poor. The Henry Street Settlement started a new community of college-educated women working for social reform and humanitarian and civic activities all across the country. Soon the settlement house movement would take off, and driven by women across the nation, would become one of the most important resources for the poor. However, settlement houses were not the only kind of reform women were spearheading. Florence Kelley, a social reformer, was a very influential figure in the world of activism. She published a report on the conditions of sweatshops that led to landmark legislation in Illinois that made a shorter workday and made child labor illegal. She also published the first scientific study on American poverty, became the secretary of the National Consumers League, and, with Lillian Wald, established the New York Child Labor Committee. The National Consumers League also advocated the importance of the public knowing and understanding the work conditions that produce their products. Florence Kelley was one of their strongest leaders. Other significant aspects to women's reform was the case of Muller v. Oregon, which upheld Oregon law by placing restrictions on the hours a woman could work. Also contributing to it was Lester Frank Ward, who was an influential sociologist who supported women's equality and opposed white supremacy. Women's reform was a significant part of the progressive era. Though politics were generally dominated by men, women used their social influence to turn their gender into an advantage. A female empowerment movement began to grow, and with it came the same-sex clubs. The formation of all-women clubs brought a new female-centric community that led participants to rally for women and children's rights, take classes, attend lectures, and more. The General Federation of Women's Clubs brought together several hundred clubs, growing to have over 150,000 members by 1900. These single-sex clubs focused on self-improvement and intellectual pursuits, and in addition to being powerful political and lobbying forces, contributed very strongly to the growing empowerment of women. Other significant aspects to women's reform was the case of Muller v. Oregon, which upheld Oregon law by placing restrictions on the hours a woman could work. Also contributing to it was Lester Frank Ward, who was an influential sociologist who supported women's equality and opposed white supremacy. Also contributing to women's social growth was the increased acceptance of women's sexuality. Margaret Sanger, an activist for freedom of sexual expression, published pamphlets for women detailing contraception methods and encouraging acceptance of their sexuality. She was arrested several times on counts of obscenity and ultimately fled to Europe. Her paper, called The Woman Rebel, stirred up much controversy and was a significant